Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name is Charlotte Higgins, and I'm Chief Arts Writer at The Guardian, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this session on the 1962 Edinburgh Writers' Conference. This is a really important session at the festival this year because, as you know, it marks the 50th anniversary of, the 50th anniversary of that event. That notorious heroin-fueled, drink-fueled scene of feuding, rowing writers, some established, some who would go on to be great, writers from Hugh MacDermott and Edwin Morgan to Mary McCarthy and Rebecca West. And aside from those well-known notorious aspects of the event, which are still talked about today, this year was that event was an event of huge significance, pioneering the very idea of the literary festival and arguably sowing the seeds of the Scottish literary renaissance. The subtitle of this event in the brochure is Putting a Bomb Under Scottish Literature, and that is exactly what happened. And I think the other thing that's really exciting about this event for me is that by talking about the 1962 event, we are going to be setting the bar really high for this year's project, which is, as we know, to restage the Edinburgh Writers' Conference, asking the best writers of today to discuss very similar questions to those that were tackled 50 years ago. And to discuss the nature and significance of that event, I am absolutely delighted to welcome here today from Strathclyde University, Angela, Bartie, Angela's nearest me, and Eleanor Bell, a historian and literary scholar, respectively, who've researched the 1962 conference, and their work is collected in this wonderful new book, The Writers' Conference Revisited, Edinburgh 1962, which is published by Calder. And this book is going to be on sale. It's absolutely fresh off the press. I had to read a proof earlier this week. And all the team on stage here will be in the signing tent immediately after this event to sign that book and to discuss further the issues that we're raising here. And last but absolutely not least, it is my incredible pleasure to welcome to this event the two chief architects, along with Sonia Orwell, the late Sonia Orwell, of that event, John Calder next to Eleanor, who in 1962 was the young publisher of John Calder Books, and Jim Haynes next to Angela, who was then the young proprietor of Edinburgh's paperback bookshop. And the wider significance of these figures needs no further explanation to this audience. So please join me in welcoming our speakers for today. So Angela and Eleanor have very kindly agreed to be the warm-up act. And that's their phrase, not mine. And so what I want to do first is ask Angela if she would briefly sketch out what Edinburgh was actually like in 1962. What were the historical conditions that prevailed then? Angela.
Okay, well, actually what I'd like to do is start by reading a quote, which some of you may actually have read before or come across, but I think it's a nice little way to start looking back at the events of 1962. This is an excerpt from a letter that Mary McCarthy wrote to her friend Hannah Arendt in September 1962, reflecting back on a conference that she'd been to in Edinburgh. People jumping up to confess that they were homosexuals. A registered heroin addict leading the young Scottish opposition to the literary tyranny of the communist Hugh MacDermott. An English woman novelist describing her communications with her dead daughter. A Dutch homosexual, former male nurse, now a Catholic convert, seeking someone to baptise him. A bearded Sikh with hair down to his waist, declaring on the platform that homosexuals were incapable of love, just as he said hermaphrodites were incapable of orgasm. Stephen Spender, in the chair, murmured he should have thought that they could have two. And all this before an audience of over 2,000 people per day, mostly, I suppose, Scottish Presbyterians. The most striking fact was the number of lunatics, both on the platform and in the public. One young woman novelist was released temporarily from a mental hospital in order to attend the conference, and she was one of the milder cases. I confess I enjoyed it enormously. So we can see there's repeated references to sexuality in this excerpt. People jumping up to confess they were homosexuals. The bearded Sikh declaring on the platform that homosexuals were incapable of love. Homosexuality was still a criminal offence at this time in Britain, and public opinion wasn't to go behind decriminalisation until 1967, just a few short years later. Edinburgh, as those of you were here in the late 50s and early 60s, was still quite a morally buttoned up city. But then so was broader society in 1962. This was pre the Profumo scandal of 1963. Sex wasn't openly discussed in public. Censorship was still the norm in literature and in theatre. Such frank discussion of such taboo topics guaranteed media attention for this conference. According to the Times, even fairly worldly journalists were disturbed by the repetition of these themes. This is interesting for me as a historian because this conference took place on the cusp of the social and cultural upheavals that were to change society in the 1960s. I feel that this conference captures the sense of transition that was in the air, and the reaction to the conference itself, but also the press coverage of it, the way people were talking about it, provide a window into the major debates of the 60s. And these include debates over identity, sexuality, morality, religion, commitment, censorship, nationality, the whole human identity. It's a snapshot of a society that's really seeking to make sense of quite rapid social and cultural change. And looking back, it also seems to be one of the first outings of what was to become the counterculture. It predates the seminal Albert Hall poetry reading of 1965, which apparently gave birth to the counterculture. This conference in 1962, the drama conference that followed it in 1963, the one at which the nude model appeared on the trolley and caused a real stushy, as I'm sure most of you know. And the poetry reading that took place on a smaller scale in Jim Haynes' Traverse in 1964. Sorry, in the bookshop in 1964. I just want to end by quoting what Jim said to me a good few years ago now in an interview, that to him Edinburgh was like a bubbling volcano to the later cultural explosion in London.
Thank you very much for that, Angela. Eleanor, could you give us a sense of where Scotland was at as a literary nation in 1962?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to start with, I mean, to think about how many literary conferences are remembered 50 years later. Working in academia, then it's rare that conferences are memorable, but for a conference such as this to be so important and to be in the public memory 50 years later is one of the reasons that drew me to researching the conference in more detail and then meeting Angela. And Angela sort of sketched out the historical qualities of the time, and I think in terms of the Scottish context at the time, I mean, everyone remembers the very famous spats between Hugh McDermid and Alexander Chalky on the Scottish Day, and of course that was one of the most sensational aspects of the conference itself, and that was my starting point really. But I began to dig a bit more deeply into the conference itself and began to see that actually that dispute between Chalky and McDermid really represented quite an interesting transition that was taking place in Scottish literature at the time. Hugh McDermid had obviously just celebrated his 70th birthday at the time.
Eleanor, can I ask you to say what that... I'll start again because I could see that wasn't being picked up. Can I just ask you, for those who aren't aware of exactly what was said, just give us that brief anecdote.
Hugh McDermid had just celebrated his 70th birthday at the time, and there was a sense, I think, amongst younger generations of Scottish writers and critics that Scottish literature really had to take account of developments that were taking place around the rest of the world and to look outwards to more international developments. So, of course, Edwin Morgan was very interested in This is the time of the beginnings of concrete poetry. Edwin Morgan was very interested in the beats, and he was really looking to, especially the United States and Brazil. Ian Hamilton Finlay was similarly looking to America and to other parts of the world, and really trying to shake up Scottish literature as they knew it. And I think that works in quite sharp juxtaposition to the legacy of Hugh McDermott's interwar Scottish literary Renaissance movement, which for some critics and writers was coming to an end at that point. And so I think there was a restlessness amongst younger writers to really shake things up. And of course, that's exactly what the conference did. I mean, I know Angela's read a quote, but there's one that we have. It's a letter from Ian Hamilton Finlay to Robert Creeley at the time, and I just thought it was maybe apt to mention this because Ian Hamilton Finlay started a very elaborate rumour on the Scottish day of the 1962 conference that he was going to stage an anti-McDermott protest march from the Mound to McEwan Hall, which the local authorities went into a blind panic and then had to ban it. But if I could... and hopefully nothing like that will be going on in the next few days. But can I just end with reading this quote? That's okay. So Ian Hamilton Finlay to Robert Creeley writes, "There was no march, of course, as no one here is on our side, but we invented it, and I said there would be a zeppelin, Tashis banners, enormous balloons, etc., and that we would march on the writers' conference. So everyone believed it, and the magistrates made a special order to ban it. March banned, but feud goes on, as one paper headlined it. Then they reported on the radio that we planned to burn effigies of public figures in the streets. Nervous trouble or not, we took a taxi up to the Scotsman newspaper, and Jessie McGuffey, his writing partner, punched the literary editor." So, yeah. Yeah, so interesting.
Well,
times.
I know there are a lot of writers who are attending this weekend's conference. All I can say is, match that. John, I would very much like to turn to you now and ask you why you decided that setting up a writers' conference in Edinburgh in 1962 was a good idea.
Well, before I go into that, I would like to say that 50 years ago, there was a protest on the opening day at the refusal of the South African government, then still having apartheid, to refuse a visa to the distinguished novelist Alan Paton to come to Edinburgh. And the whole 70 writers present agreed to send a strong protest at the time, which was generally voted by all those present to take place. And the protest I would like to start off with today is the only living person who was present 50 years ago, the distinguished literary figure Alexander Stefanovich, a Serb who described the Yugoslav novel and what it was about at the time, has been refused a visa to come here by the British consulate in Rome because he's a Serb and therefore associated with Kosovo. He had nothing at all to do with it. This is the man who brought Dr. Zhivago out of Russia to the West and also edited at the time the most distinguished literary magazine in Yugoslavia, refused an invitation to come here. I would invite all of you to join me in a protest to the Foreign Ministry in London and to the consulate in Rome at the refusal to allow this distinguished figure to come here, the only one still alive who was officially invited and refused entry. Well, now to go on to the beginning. Thank you. To go back to the beginnings, in 1959, I had been a publisher for 10 years, publishing largely political books, protesting about some of the conditions at the time, McCarthyism in America, certain aspects of colonialism in Britain. In 1958, I published a book called Gangrene that was, and received a D notice, which meant that I would be prosecuted if this book came out and possibly go to prison. Well, having a number of influential MPs among my friends, I took a chance and went ahead. And immediately after the 1958 election, when the Macmillan government was returned with a small majority, the very first item on the new government's agenda at the first cabinet meeting was this book, Gangrene, as the result of which, after discussion, the Hola camps, in which more than 60,000 people had been imprisoned for years, with hundreds dying under terrible conditions, were finally released, which did not lead to a general massacre of the whites, as the Daily Express, among other papers, predicted, but led to a peaceful settlement, and ultimately that so-called arch-villain of the right-wing press, Jomo Kenyatta, became Prime Minister of Kenya, and immediately applied to rejoin the British Empire. So in those days, my political publishing, which was always attacked by the right-wing press, had had some influence. But I was now beginning to publish literary books, which were almost universally condemned by the critics of the day, who were themselves all English novelists. People like Samuel Beckett, who was called by the Sunday Times a strange writer, and it said, mescaline might help, but don't count on it. And Eugene Ionesco, Alain Robespierre, French writers. Now, in 1958, I did a promotion where I sent 3 French novelists around British universities, including Edinburgh, to promote their books. And I made a discovery during that tour that the audience were far more interested in having a number of writers arguing between themselves about what they were trying to do, the way they went about writing, often disagreeing with each other. This was far more interesting to the public than an individual writer just talking about his books. And particularly in Coventry, where 800 young people, all about 20, all working class, because there was no university in Coventry at the time, got incredibly involved and mobbed these writers, because for the first time they realized that literature could actually affect their lives. It was about their lives to a great extent, the importance of writers. And as a result of that experience, I invited Lord Harwood, the new director of the Edinburgh Festival, to lunch and said, you know, Edinburgh has got a literary history. The festival is all about music and drama. There's never been a literary aspect to it. Why not have a big writers' conference? And he agreed finally to have one, providing it didn't lose any money. It had to pay for itself. So for 3 years, I worked very hard to raise the money, get support from all over, with almost universal hostility from the press generally, particularly from Edinburgh citizens writing in to the Scotsman, always saying we need money for the drains, not for culture. And but the protests, I found out, brought in counter-protests and found supporters. Literary Edinburgh on the whole was against it. Writers said, well, we're accustomed to talking to the public. Nobody pays to hear us talk. What are we paying expenses to all these foreign writers for? Who wants to hear them anyhow? But largely because of the press reception and of the hostility beforehand, the first day was widely reported. The Edinburgh Festival sent one single cashier to sell tickets, but an hour before it started, there were over 1,000 people queuing to get in. And I had to ring them up desperately to send more people to man the box office. Also, we had a program to sell and earphones in 3 languages to rent to people for the day. Also, the earphones enabled you to hear even English more clearly, because McEwan Hall did not have the world's best acoustic. But what really made that first day work, to the amazement of everybody, was the frank speech you've been hearing about. I mean, love was occasionally talked about, but the word sex was not a word you ever heard in polite conversation. You know, it's like a four-letter word today, but much worse. And to hear people from different countries, writers, particularly the Dutch, discussing their sexuality, quite frankly, absolutely amazed the newspapers, and the Scotsman in particular, with Magnus Magnusson writing about it, got us onto the front pages, and the foreign press reported it as well. So for the second day, we were absolutely packed, 2,300 people queuing to get into McEwan Hall every day. And of course the temperature rose day by day, and other controversial subjects were discussed. Scottish literature on the second day, where there was a famous ding-dong between Hugh MacDiarmid and Alexander Trochy, who nobody ever heard of. It was only published at that time when he had one novel, but a number of books published by Olympia Press in Paris, which were, you know, so-called DB, dirty books.
Can I ask you, just for people who don't know what was actually said between MacDiarmid and Trochy, could you remind people?
Well, MacDiarmid, you know, although he was a dissident, was also a rather conventional character in many ways, and didn't believe in all this frank discussion, and particularly with against European literature. I mean, he said on the platform, literature should be against our big enemy, England. And wanted Scottish literature to be only about Scotland. And that applied to many other people. David Dykes, who was in the chair, tried to keep order. But I mean, there was a discussion, most of them on MacDiarmid's side, but not entirely. And the papers reported the argument, and the BBC that evening got the two of them on the radio together to continue the argument. Ultimately, Trochy and MacDiarmid became friends of a sort and began to agree with each other in many ways, but the opening day was just hostility. But it was the argument between writers, between Rebecca West and Mary McCarthy, who loathed each other, and between Khushwant Singh, who was a bit of an old Puritan Indian writer, and Angus Wilson, who had totally different ideas about sexuality and so on, who argued with each other. Norman Mailer, who put in his own particular protests and wanted to take over the conference more and more as the time went on. With writers who nobody ever heard of in this country came forward and became stars. And the public began to applaud different points of view. And they began to play for more and more applause from the audience. Every time one of them spoke and got applause from one part of the hall, the other one then spoke against him or her and got applause from another part of the hall. And they were fighting each other to get more applause. Writers became actors for the first time in their lives and enjoyed it. And that is really what made that conference work. And it was reported widely. It was also received the major publicity of that year, as a result of which Lord Harwood, the whole thing was over, said, "What are you going to do next year?" I said, what about a drama conference? He said, "Get on with it." And of course I did. Now Jim Haynes was a bookseller at the time, and I gave him permission to set up a bookstall in McEwan Hall, and he was raided by the police on the censorship day, the fourth day, by putting on an exhibition of books that had been censored, not books that were being censored then. Think books like Ulysses and old Roman classics and so on. Police came, saw nothing wrong, went away. The whole thing was organized by the extremely puritanical Lord Provost's secretary, a man called Murdoch. Lord Harwood used to say MRA, because modern rearmament was a potent force in Scotland at the time. Murdoch rides again. And Murdoch caused us other problems, and I think he was mainly responsible for the big row the following year, which I will not talk about now. But that conference brought free speech out into the open. And Jim's bookshop, because Jim came as a volunteer to help, and also helped in a lot of other ways, finding accommodation for writers and so on. He also created almost a scandal, because one of the things he agreed to do was take the conference papers around to various delegates, and one of them was the official Yugoslav, not Stefanovic, who couldn't come this year, but a man called Šegadin, who happened to be a Croat, whereas Stefanovic was a Serb. Because Jim didn't get the papers there on time, the man didn't get his papers, missed half the opening day, turned up in the middle of Stefanovic giving a talk on the Yugoslav novel, was furious because, being a diplomat as well as an author, he felt it was his right to do it. So there was a big argument that nearly led to the Yugoslav, because there were orchestra, there was a ballet company, an opera company, an orchestra, an art exhibition, and a number of festival artists from Yugoslavia, the festival that year, nearly being pulled out by the ambassador, who thought the whole thing was a CIA plot to embarrass Yugoslavia.
I think Jim may have to defend himself from these charges. But just to remind people what Trocky did say, he said the whole atmosphere seems to me to be, this is of Scotland, seems to me turgid, petty, provincial, the stale porridge Bible class nonsense. It makes me ashamed to sit here in front of my collaborators in this conference. So it was a very sharp and angry exchange. But Jim, aside from nearly causing this diplomatic incident, can you talk about your role, and can you talk about what it felt like to be in the midst of this conference in your adoptive hometown, welcoming in these extraordinary writers from overseas, putting them together with the Scottish writers? Did you feel that something of immense significance was happening?
Yeah, no doubt about it. It was incredibly exciting, talking before the conference began in various restaurants and cafes of Paris with John and with Sonia. Sonia, who I think deserves great credit for bringing, quote, her pals. She got Mary McCarthy and Norman Mailer, and getting Mary McCarthy and Norman Mailer and Niccolo Tucci and anyone else, one or two others, that she personally brought as her friends to come to Edinburgh to a party.
And you managed not to fall out with Sonia ultimately, because I know there was a bit of a bottling incident. Which you might like to share with the audience?
Well, I don't know if John wants me to be reminded, but since he reminded everyone of my failing to deliver, I think it's only fair to say that in the Greek restaurant in Rose Street, we had a quiet dinner one night discussing various aspects of the upcoming conference. This was, I don't know when it was, July, summer of '62. And at a certain point in the meal, completely out of the blue, totally unexpected, she pulls a wine bottle out from somewhere. There's always a wine bottle around Sonia. And she pulls this wine bottle out and hits John over the head. And I thought, my God, she's killed John. He passed out. I panicked. And a few minutes later, John revived and we continued the conversation. And planning ensued.
I've suddenly got a very vivid image of what goes on.
Very passion, a lot of passion, you know.
Yeah, yes. Is this like the Edinburgh Book Festival planning office that we know and love today? But Jim, talk a bit more about the actual conference and the feeling as it was going on with all the writers in town. And
well, one of Lord Harwood's major concern was we were not to lose money, and one of my roles was to find accommodation for writers and in private homes. So I had a lot of customers, maybe some even here today, who came regularly to the bookshop, and I would badger them and say, how would you like to host Norman Mailer or Henry Miller or William Burroughs or whoever? And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, we were successful in finding, the budget when you don't have to pay hotel bills is a big factor. You know, we were able, and also many of them provided party facilities. So we had many parties in private homes. Well, all the parties were in private homes after each day. So not only did we have 70 writers on the stage of the McEwan Hall, almost continuously they would nip out to use the toilet facilities or to have a glass of wine or a shot of whiskey. But they were almost all the time on stage. And the chairman of the day encouraged notes to be passed up from the audience. So notes were continuously being passed up, and they would be read, and the chairman, if he thought it was appropriate, would then question one of the writers from the note that was passed up. So it was a dialogue more than a monologue, and it was a dialogue with not only amongst the writers but amongst the public. And for me it was exceedingly exciting because, the first day, the first Monday, I went outside and saw this enormous queue. And I went to the end of the queue, and there were two attractive young women. And I've always been interested in young women, attractive young women. And at the end of the queue, I went up to them and said, why have you come today? And they said, well, we're big Henry Miller and Lawrence Durrell fans, and we understand that they're going to be inside. Is that true? And I said, yes, it's true. And they kind of said, how do you know? And I said, well, I just know. And they said, well, are you sure? And I said, well, look, come with me. And I pulled them away from the queue to the then Men's Union. I think it's called Teviot now or something, but it was called the Men's Union at the time. And we had reserved the dining room facilities for lunch for all the writers before the afternoon session. When did the afternoon session begin? At 1 o'clock? 2 o'clock. So around 1 o'clock in the dining room facilities, I bring these two young ladies up and set them between Henry Miller and Lawrence Durrell. And they became our mascots, and they served at all the parties. They came to the rest of the conference to all the parties and served drinks, and so it's and one of them is still a friend today, even though I don't see her that much. She lives in Vancouver, someplace in West Canada, but she's still a friend today.
How very forgiving of her. John, could you talk a bit about what you think the legacy of 62 was?
Well, I think it was one of the factors that changed Edinburgh from a very puritanical Calvinist city into, the open city it is today. And Jim's bookshop certainly had an effect, because Jim, in his paperback bookshop, was selling books that no other bookshop would sell. He was the only publisher after 1961, when it was first published, to stock Lady Chatterley's Lover, which a lady missionary came in one day, bought a copy, took it out between fire togs.
No. First thing she did was pay for it and said, I'll be back in 30 minutes to collect it. And her alarm rang, and I said, this is problem. This is a trouble. Why is she coming back in 30 minutes to collect the book? So I called Alan Daches, whose photographs can be seen in here. He was the photographer of Edinburgh at the time, and a good friend of ours. And he came. I called. I said, Alan, bring your camera and come immediately to the bookshop. And she came in 30 minutes, and she picked up the book with cold tongs. She wouldn't touch it. Carried it outside, and it was, there's a picture here. There's a picture of her in the bookshop. There's also a famous picture I think it's on the Guardian website, of her actually setting fire, pouring, kerosene or something, I don't know
petrol.
what. Petrol or something onto the book, lighting it and ranting and raving. And at the time we just thought it was maybe an eccentric, crazy lady, but later we began to suspect it might have something to do with moral rearmament, didn't we, John?
Well, it was moral rearmament who started the protests the following year. and the tabloid press, scenting a scandal, built up what was an extremely successful last day, which was in the second year was not as interesting as the first one for complicated reasons. If I'm still around next year, I will talk about them. But it was not as successful as the first year. But the scandal on the last day, of course, made it notorious. It got it into the press. And of course, it was the same Murdoch and the then rather silly Lord Provost, a man called Duncan Weatherstone, who shut down the conferences after the second year. We meant to have a poetry one the third year, which just never took place. Also, Harvard was getting into trouble for a variety of reasons those days, and shortly afterwards resigned. Great pity, because Harvard, by the way, was one of the festival's great directors. But there were a lot of other people involved. Malcolm Muggeridge was meant to chair the whole thing, but for personal reasons, left after the first day.
Because Sonia Orwell said no.
Exactly. At which point Angus Wilson took over, and then we had different chairmen every day until finally Norman Mailer and Kushwant Singh became, on the last day, the joint chairman, and ran things rather differently. But every morning at 11 o'clock we had a session to discuss who was going to talk and just briefly find out who wanted to say what. Didn't tell them what to say, but put it into a kind of order. And people who were completely unknown came out, spoke well, found they had an audience there that liked what they were saying, liked them personally. So people like Eric Fried, an unknown Austrian poet who had been living since before the war in Britain, became one of the stars. But Dr. Azad from Egypt had his particular claque there. And of course, Mary McCarthy and Virginia, Rebecca West were always on their feet, arguing with each other and so on. And antagonisms took place. So it was supporting this or that writer that for many of the people there made it a particularly interesting and eventful, enjoyable event. But the public had never heard this kind of free speech beforehand. And the hostility of local writers to it, I remember only 2 local writers who really gave us support. But some of the best known people there were against us. But I mean, the French writers who I particularly want to promote, none of them came that year because they said, well, August is when you go to the beach, not to Edinburgh. But the drama conference the following year, we had full of French writers because they were very much regretted having been missing because of the publicity. So the second year, the whole tone was a bit different, and the people.
I'm actually very keen to open this up to the wider audience because I'm very aware that there are lots of members of the public here. There are also lots of writers who are involved in this year's conference, but kind of excitingly, there are also people here who were at the original conference in 1962, and I think it would be great to hear from some of you. So in a rather peculiar move, I'm going to hand this microphone, because this is the handheld microphone, over to somebody. And I'm going to stand here. So there's a gentleman at the front.
My name is Hugh Kerr. I wasn't at the 62 conference, John, but I was at the 63 one. And so I'm looking forward to next year, and I hope you'll still be around. But actually, your point about the Serbian who couldn't come here because the British Foreign Office stopped him coming to Scotland does bring up a point which I want to ask the panel about. And looking back 50 years, about Scottish literature and the Renaissance in Scottish literature. Jim Kelman has published a wonderful polemic as to why he's not going to be at the Writers' Conference this year, because it's organised and sponsored by the British Council which he accuses of many crimes, including reinforcing the cultural apparatus of the British state, collaborating with the Israelis, and so on. So if anybody's going to punch you, Charlotte, it's probably going to be Jim Kelman. But I want you to reflect back on how Scottish was it in 1962, and what was the impact, you think, in terms of Scottish literature, which is clearly much healthier today?
Who'd like to kick off with that?
Eleanor,
yeah.
Say a few words. I mean, I think in my own research, I've been looking at the 1960s, and so far there hasn't been a monograph on that period, and it's such an interesting time in literary history. And I really see the 62 conference as a starting point for this. As I mentioned earlier, the debates that were opening out at the time in little magazines anyway, and the sense of dissatisfaction that was growing, the need to expand horizons and so on. And I think that's one of the interesting things that came out of the conference, was bringing so many people together in a way that they could then reflect on these in such a high profile way that had never been done before. And I think that gave a lot of young writers and artists the confidence then to break out of perhaps more molds that were perhaps regarded as being more introverted or parochial or so on. And so that's part of the interesting research we've been doing for this book, is to interview some of the people who were around then. We interviewed Alexander Moffat, Sandy Moffat, who was at the conference then. Fortunately can't be here today, but we have a really great interview with him where he talks about the ways in which the 62 conference really opened his eyes as a young undergraduate and gave him the confidence and inspiration to go on and then integrate art and literature in his works, but also still being very identified with Hugh McDermott and the legacy of the Renaissance movement. So I think there's lots of really interesting intersections and lots of doors that have still to be that were still opening at that time.
John, I'm interested also in the remark by the speaker there about, refuse next. Writers and artists, for whatever reason, decided not to come. And there were a few people in 62 who you wanted to come who couldn't come or didn't come. Graham Greene, for example. Was there anyone who took a principled stand and didn't come, or was it more circumstantial?
No, I think it was because they didn't
believe it was going to happen.
They didn't really believe it was going to happen. I mean, the press was very hostile on the whole, and up to the last moment they were ringing people who were invited to come, who had been announced to come, who decided at the last minute they'd rather be on the beach or somewhere else. We thought they'd be wasting their time. Aldous Huxley, Graham Greene, people like that. Compton Mackenzie, who was a big Edinburgh name at the time, and who wrote the introduction to the program, agreed to come. At the last minute he decided he'd rather be at his holiday house in France. So although he wished us well, he just wasn't there. A lot of people just didn't believe it would really happen, or that if it did happen, it'd be a success. I might mention briefly my own book, which will be at the bookshop afterwards.
John, I was going to do that for you. Spare your blushes.
Pursuit has one of the only first-hand accounts of really what happened in both those years, 62 and 63, including some photographs. So, I myself hardly slept night after night because I would be dreaming up new ways of making the next day more exciting. But the press reaction gave me new ideas, and I was always trying to change the format a bit day by day, and it really worked. I was surprised by anybody by the great success of it all, although I had spent a great deal of time promoting it among a few journalists who in fact were enthusiastic and did give me support, particularly the Scotsman, Magnus Magnusson, Bill Watson, who was a literary editor, Christopher McElhose, who was the feature, and it was the other way around. But but generally speaking, most of the press was very, very hostile, particularly the Scottish press. So they were all surprised by what really happened, and by the people who came, but particularly by the way that the public suddenly flocked.
Embraced.
embraced the whole thing.
So, excuse me, John, I'm so sorry. The microphone's over there, and I'm keen to squash in some more questions.
Hi. I was just wondering whether John Calder has any more memories of the particular disagreements between Khushwant Singh and Angus Wilson, and whether he also thinks that the bearded Sikh referred to by Mary McCarthy in her comments was actually, referred to Khushwant.
Yeah, well, Khushwant Singh was an author who I was publishing at the time, or about to publish, I think, distinguished Indian writer, who also had been the editor of the Times of India.
Who's still alive today.
Over 100.
Yeah.
But he had a son at Oxford who in fact was gay. The word didn't exist, gay, in those days, which was one reason that he was opposed to homosexual love and attacked it as such. But of course nobody knew that at the time. He took a rather puritanical stance. On the other hand, he was one of the political writers who was attacking British colonialism. And on the third day, which was about colonial problems and, generally speaking, British policy towards its colonies, we had a number of African and Eastern writers who were bitterly attacking the British government. These were the days when Cyprus, Kenya, other parts of the old empire were trying to get their independence and so on, particularly African colonies. And that was one of the subjects that was really bitterly debated on the third day. The fourth day we went on to censorship, and I asked at one point, or at least the chairman asked those who were opposed to censorship to put up their hands, and a forest of hands went up. At least 80% of those present, remember there were 2,300 people there every day, a large number, and the great majority just voted against censorship. And Henry Miller, when he spoke very quietly. He said, why should a writer, both gentle and person in the world, a threat to nobody, not be allowed to put his own words down on paper without being attacked? Why is it legal to do things you cannot put down in print? That conference had a lot to do with the reforms of the 60s, which brought an end to capital punishment, made homosexuality no longer an in-principle crime, brought in a number of other reforms, anti-censorship in the theatre, and gradually it faded out.
Elimination of the Lord Chamberlain.
Faded out in the novel as well. Remember, this was 2 years, 2 years after the Lady Chatterley trial. No, the 1 year after, 1961. Things were already beginning to change, but I think the conference pushed those changes forward much faster.
Thank you very much. The microphone's over here, and then I want to bring it down towards this end of the room. So, hands in the air, please.
My name's Angus McNichol. A quick question for Jim Haynes and a comment on an aspect of the festival. For Jim, I would ask, were there queues outside your shop door after the burning of Lady C?
Alan Dage's photographs went around the world and Sir Alan Lane wrote me a letter of congratulations, of Penguin Books. He said, thank you very much. And yeah, a lot of people would come, and I had other books that were not allowed, and I remember people would use code words. Do you have a copy of Alice in Wonderland? Yes, Alice in Wonderland, and that meant, what did that mean, Alice in Wonderland?
Where's the microphone?
Sorry,
Fanny Hill, I think.
If I could just briefly make an observation. I've been reading Hamish Henderson's Letters, fascinating book to read. It covers a great many aspects of Scottish culture. I don't know whether Hamish himself was at the event, but I would think he was one of those who had a more international outlook. But what did strike me from the letters is that Hugh McDermott could start a row in an empty house.
Thank you. Well, can I just bring the microphone to this gentleman here, please? And Go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Jim should maybe make another confession about the spats on the Scottish Day as well. There was always a jug of water on the table, but
Oh, yes.
Jim changed the water that was in the jug that day. Would you like to confess, Jim?
John said something about serving the wine of the country. Let's get some wine or something. I said, let's serve the wine of the country, and got whiskey and put it.
The microphone's here. And if there are any women who want to say something, please do.
I was there, and I was a customer of yours, Jim, in the paperback bookshop, and I remember the rhinoceros head over the doorway of the shop. I was going to ask about that whiskey incident, because as I recall, it was Glen Grant, which was almost colourless, and it had been put in the water carafes. I think it was Sidney Goodsir Smith who discovered that it was whiskey, and things went more lively after that.
Exactly.
Before the mic goes there, the lady with the yellow, or person, sorry, I can't see a blinking thing. There, yeah, with the yellow delegate's lanyard.
I'm Kirsty Gunn, and I'm a delegate for this year's conference. I've thoroughly enjoyed a wonderful anecdote-fueled discussion, and I think it describes that there's a great challenge ahead for us, perhaps in the next few days, to disentangle the personal from the political, perhaps, and the aesthetic and the intellectual. I was wondering what the panel think about, as the question at the kick-started our questions suggested. It's very difficult, isn't it, to split a discussion of aesthetics and purely intellectual literary ideas from the political and the personal. What's ahead for us?
John, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I mean, this year, it's obviously going to take a totally different aspect. I mean, the big problems today are differences between minorities here, particularly immigrant communities, at a time of economic depression and often religious and ethnic hostility and unemployment growing. I mean, we're looking forward to a rather violent future and a crime wave coming up, I think, which is, I hope will be discussed before it happens, because discussion might make people more aware and take some kind of advanced action to create public opinion, you know, in a liberal direction. But we're certainly coming into controversial times. Censorship, I think, will continue, but it's going to be political censorship in future, far more than moral censorship. And you know, there are new topics that will be raised by different people there, and we shall see. You know, I'm not going to make predictions, but I'm sure that whenever you get writers together, they're bound to disagree, have different opinions, and bring fresh insight into the world in which we're moving, which is going to be a rather difficult time. I mean, there I am, rather pessimistic about the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Kirsty, for that question. There's a very, very patient hand here, gentleman towards the back.
I think, like a few people in the room, I wasn't actually conceived in 1962. But one thing that interests me about the conference is the actual format. And I'm wondering how the 62 format differed from, well, a format like today, where we have a relatively small audience, as opposed to 2,000 people. We have others in the room in terms of television and internet broadcast and twittering. But there seemed to be much more of a bun fight going on between the authors than perhaps might be engendered by the more polite format that we perhaps see today. I just wondered if Jim and maybe John would comment on that.
Jim, do you want to start?
Well, as everyone knows, the Writers' Conference that evolved in Edinburgh, and that's taking place annually, and which I come to every year from Paris, and always find delightful, is very much, I hate to say the dirty word, promoting a book. usually. Someone has just written a book, and they give a talk about the book, and then they go sign copies of the book. You know, nothing wrong with that. The particular 62 and 63 conferences that John and I orchestrated were more about ideas in general, society in general, the role of the writer in general in society, rather than promoting a particular object to sell, you know, a particular book. And I think that's what made it valuable and exciting and meaningful. I've nothing against anyone promoting a book. I mean, I've got a book which I didn't bring, which I could have. But I highly recommend Pursuit, which I've read, and I highly recommend this book, which the two ladies on my right and left have made. It's wonderful. But the idea of discussing abstract ideas or political ideas amongst writers and the public is fairly unique. There are not many places available today even to do that, you know.
John, would you like to add to that?
Well, I'm not really quite sure what the question really is. Obviously, free discussion leads to subjects being aired, opinions growing and so on. But we live in a far more mixed society today than it used to be. We've got new communities here, many of which have become ghettos. And they've all got their own culture and way of looking at things. And quite a lot of, you know, the new criminalities are to do with cultural differences. You read about them in the press. We are living in a different society. I'm not sure that it's not going to be a more dangerous one. But I think discussions between writers can help to make people more aware, and therefore perhaps it might help to bring some of those cultures together. I'm a great believer in a single system of education. In 1906, France was the first country in Europe to make schooling one system throughout the whole country. France. The people from different backgrounds, different nationalities, languages, religions and so on, went to the same schools, learned the same languages, which is why France has a society where all kinds of different people get on together, unlike parts of Britain like Northern Ireland, where, you know, school children from different schools do not dare meet on the street or cross each other's paths because they would attack each other, because that is the culture in which they are taught to grow up. We have to change all that, and the only way in which we can do it is by having one system where children grow up together, learn to know each other, learn to respect each other, and have a mutual tolerance.
And I think on that note of tolerance, I'm very sad to say, going to have to close this session, but I've found it wonderful listening to you four. Thank you so much. I think it's laid down a number of thoughts that will be returned to. I think Kirsty Gunn's point about the extent to which the personal and the political, the aesthetic and the public can or should be disentangled is something that writers will go away with and think about for this afternoon. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming. John's memoir, Pursuit, is on sale in the bookshop, and the book by Eleanor and Angela is going to be in the signing tent where we will now go. And I hope that you will follow us there, giving us a little time to get out of the door before you do. But please join me in thanking our panel today.